Ever get curious about what humans were up to way, way back, like a million years before recorded history even begins? It's like peeking at the very last page of a book and realizing there's a whole library of stories we've missed. But today, we're cracking open those dusty volumes, diving into a version of human history that you might not expect. We're taking a deep dive into the Urantia book. Now, this book lays out this really interesting, really specific version of where humans came from, saying it all comes from cosmic records. Pretty wild stuff. But for today, we're going to treat everything it says as fact, just to see where it takes us. Picture this. It's almost a million years ago. No cities, no Instagram, just ice, and a lot of it. And smack dab in the middle of this frozen world, you've got this small group of very, very early humans just trying to survive. That's where we meet Andon and Fanta, who, in this book at least, are considered our very first ancestors.
Yeah, it's wild how the Urantia book puts them in this really specific time and place about a million years ago during the Pleistocene epoch, which you probably know better as the Ice Age. And they weren't living in some tropical paradise either. It was brutal.
Yeah, I was reading about those massive glaciers like pushing down from the north. And if that wasn't bad enough, the book mentions Andon and Fanta had some distant cousins, for lack of a better term, living down south, and they weren't exactly keen on a family reunion.
Not quite. See, the book suggests that these early humans, they didn't want to mix with those less evolved hominids. They saw it as like this important step to protect their own development, which is fascinating when you think about it, how early humans viewed anyone different from them and the choices they made to, shape their own future. So stuck between glaciers on one side and an awkward family reunion on the other, they had to get creative just to survive.
Talk about a harsh reality check. You kind of wonder how they did more than just survive, How'd they end up flourishing?
It really speaks to the resilience of humans. Our ability to invent, to adapt. The book highlights two groups from this time, the Foxhall people over in Europe and the Bedonan tribes in India. They were able to keep their culture alive, keep those embers burning, even with the world throwing everything it had at them.
India and Europe. We're talking some serious travel back then. Guess humans always had that adventurous streak, huh?
Right. Don't forget, we're talking hundreds of thousands of years here. Continents were practically connected, land bridges everywhere. It's like a constant migration, genes mixing, which really shaped what it means to be human.
Speaking of mixing genes, this is where things get, well, a little more familiar. We're talking Neanderthals, but not the boring museum exhibit versions. The Urantia book gives us a fresh take on them.
Yeah, the text claims the Neanderthals actually descended from those early humans, the Bedonan tribe we were talking about. They were these awesome hunters, even fishing through ice holes. Can you believe that? Talk about hardcore.
Ice fishing in the Ice Age. These guys were serious about fresh food. I can't even imagine how cold they're.
And resourceful. They used reindeer horns and bones for their tools, showing they could adapt, invent, whatever the environment threw at them. It really makes you think about how environmental pressure drives innovation, even today, don't you think?
It makes you think, what kind of crazy innovations will WE come up with given the challenges we're facing now? Makes you think. But anyway, it sounds like those Neanderthals, they had it figured out. Tough, adaptable. But I'm sensing a but coming on here. Didn't the Neanderthals also have a, shall we say, a darker side, according to the book?
Yeah, unfortunately, it wasn't all sunshine and roses for our Neanderthal friends. The book suggests that they developed some pretty intense beliefs, mostly out of fear, really. Like, imagine being constantly afraid of the dark, thinking you had to make sacrifices to the moon just to, keep things running smoothly.
Really makes you think, doesn't it? Progress isn't always a straight line, is it? Even as humans were making tools, figuring out how to survive, they were also trying to make sense of a world they didn't understand, facing some very real fears.
And sometimes those attempts to understand the world, well, they took some pretty interesting turns.
Which leads us to a pretty major plot twist in the story of early humans. Around 500,000 years ago, the Urantia book introduces us to a family that changes everything, the Sanjic family. And let me tell you, this is where things get wild.
This isn't your typical family, that's for sure.
This is where things get really interesting. And by interesting, I mean, potentially hard to wrap your head around. See, according to the book, the Sanjic family, they had kids who became the ancestors of all the different colored races, and they were all supposedly born at the same time.
It's definitely not your average origin story. Most planets, at least according to this book, see new races pop up over, long periods. But Urantia, they got it all at once from one family. It's definitely a powerful image, whether you take it literally or not.
Okay, so let's meet the family, right? We've got the red race, known for building civilizations, inventing tools like the bow and arrow, and even having ties to the ancestors of Native Americans. Although, sounds like they're also no stranger to a little conflict.
Yeah, the book suggests that the Red Race, they had some internal conflicts, made them a bit vulnerable. They clashed with other groups, especially the Yellow Race, and eventually got pushed out of Asia. Shows you that even as civilizations grow, those internal divisions, they can really hold you back.
So, if the Red Race got pushed out, who did the pushing?
Well, the Yellow Race, it seems. Yeah. They were more about that settled life, farming, building communities, working together, which might sound familiar if you think about their connections to some modern Asian populations.
Different strokes for different folks, right? Even back then. But what about the Orange Race? Weren't they the builders, the engineers? They seem pretty advanced, so what happened there?
The Orange Race, they're a perfect example of how even a super advanced culture isn't guaranteed to make it. Despite their impressive building skills, they ended up wiped out.
Wiped out? By whom?
The Green Race, apparently. Seems they were even more aggressive, constantly expanding their territory. It's a pretty stark reminder that human history, it's not always about progress. It's got its share of setbacks, and sometimes even the greatest civilizations, they crumble.
Really makes you think. All right, so we've got the red, the yellow, and the orange races covered. What about the Green Race? Sounds like they were a force to be reckoned with.
Oh yeah, they were constantly on the move, like constantly, crossing huge distances. You could call them the original nomads, but on a global scale. But the book uses their story as kind of a warning.
Yeah.
See, all that moving around eventually led to their downfall. They spread themselves too thin, made themselves vulnerable.
It's like that saying, right? Don't spread yourself too thin. Seems like it applies to whole civilizations, not just people. So what about the Blue Race? Weren't they the artists, the thinkers, the philosophers of the bunch?
Exactly. The book describes them as drawn to beauty, music, deep thinking, even way back then. And here's the really cool part. It actually lines up with some of the archaeological finds from that time, especially in Europe. You've got the Cro-Magnon people who lived around the same time, and suddenly, boom, explosion of art, dance tools, the whole shebang.
Wow. Makes you wonder if that drive to create, to explore ideas, it's like hardwired into us from the very beginning.
It's a question worth pondering, for sure.
Yeah.
And finally, that brings us to the Indigo Race. Now, their story is one of resilience, facing some really tough situations. Isolated in Africa, they have their own unique set of challenges.
Sounds like every race had their own struggles, their own victories. What stands out about the Indigo Race's story?
The really crucial part is that the Urantia book makes a point of saying, all these races, they were all equal, even the ones who faced the toughest circumstances. It's like this message to look past those simple stories of progress and see the inherent dignity in every branch of humanity, regardless of what they went through.
Right. It's like this reminder that we all share the same origin story, even if it's a pretty complicated one. I mean, you've got all these groups migrating, interacting, sometimes clashing. It's a lot to wrap your head around.
It was a wild time, for sure. As the Ice Age started to end, it set off this chain reaction of migrations. Land bridges disappeared, forcing everyone to adapt to new places, new climates, and, well, each other.
So how'd they decide who went where? Was it like a prehistoric game of musical chairs?
Not exactly. Geography had a lot to do with it. Take the Red Race, for example. When the ice retreated, they followed migrating animals across this land bridge that used to connect Siberia and Alaska.
So that's how they ended up in North America. Fascinating. What about the Orange Race? Where did their journey take them?
South, unfortunately. Right into the path of the Green Race. And, well, let's just say the Green Race wasn't exactly known for their hospitality. It really shows how tough it was back then, even for the groups who seemed to have it figured out.
Makes you think twice about complaining about traffic, huh? But even with all the conflicts, it feels like the Urantia book is trying to tell us something hopeful too, don't you think?
Definitely. Even in those brutal times, you see this incredible resilience. Take the Red Race, for example, ending up in North America. When that land bridge went kaput, they could have easily given up, right? Stuck in a new environment. But no, they rolled with the punches. They adapted. They built these amazing cultures full of tradition and, a real sense of something bigger than themselves.
It really shows you what humans are capable of, even when it seems like the odds are stacked against them.
Exactly. So while all that was happening over in North America, the Blue Race over in Europe, they had this whole other interaction going on. Remember the Neanderthals?
Oh, right. Sharing territory with the Blue Race, weren't they?
That's right. And we're not just talking about, living in the same zip code.
Yeah.
The Urantia book suggests they were mixing it up, exchanging ideas, even genes.
Wait, hold up. Interbreeding. Isn't that, I thought we weren't supposed to be buddy-buddy with the Neanderthals, right?
Right. It kind of throws a wrench into that whole us versus them story we
Mm.
tell about early humans, doesn't it?
Right.
But really, it just shows how interconnected everything is. We're all products of this crazy mix of migration, interaction, even yeah, interbreeding. The lines get blurry real fast.
It really is amazing how we're all connected, even back to those early humans.
Speaking of connections, the Urantia book, it doesn't shy away from the spiritual side of things, even way back then, long before Adam and Eve came along. They call it the Adamic era in the book, by the way,
We'll have to save that part of the story for another deep dive. Definitely a lot to unpack there.
for sure. But before we wrap up, I do think it's worth mentioning that even in those pre-Adamic times, you had individuals who were searching for something more, something beyond just survival. The book talks about this one guy, Orvanon, who lived with the Indigo race in Africa. He started this whole spiritual awakening among his people. Pretty remarkable.
Wow. It's amazing to think about those early spiritual seekers, wrestling with those big questions about existence thousands of years ago. Speaks to something universal in us, I think.
Totally. That search for meaning, for purpose, it's not limited by time or culture. It's part of being human,
Well,
wouldn't you say?
absolutely. Well, as we wrap up this deep dive, I have to say it's pretty mind-blowing to think about everything we've covered. A million years of human evolution, migration, innovation, resilience. It's a lot to process.
It really is. What's sticking with you? What will you take away from this journey into our ancient past?
For me, it's that reminder that some things, they never change. The drive to survive, the desire to find our place in the world, the power of community, those things, they're timeless. And if those early humans could face their challenges head on, with courage and ingenuity, imagine what we can do today with all the knowledge and resources we have available. It's inspiring.
It is. And it makes you think, what will we do with all that we've learned, all that we've inherited? What kind of world will we build, and what will our legacy be for the generations to come? Something to think about.